much of this stuff has been tragically committed by the much more complicated person Obama. And he's sustaining this now. There's just a report by Scott Horton on Harper's of the murder of 3 prisoners who were supposed to be released at the secret site at Guantanamo. All over the English newspapers this week. I report on it briefly on my blog on the announcement for this film. The blog is Democratic Individuality with a dash, blogspot.com. You can connect with the articles there. It's worth reading. Straight murder. There are 100 murders in Pentagon custody. You get imprisoned by the United States and you be Brown. The crime of torture is a normal thing. They murdered 100 people. You might check out how many people Obama now wants to lock away forever. His corruption about Guantanamo.
47.
Right, 47. 580 people at Guantanamo now been released. 380. Might think about all those murders, what they mean. There isn't any question that this is a legal issue. Joseph Corbell invited me to co-teach with him his course on comparative communism. He shared with me a great deal of information about who he was in Czechoslovakia. He was a Democrat. And what that meant in the era of the rise of Hitler in Eastern Europe was that he allied himself with communists. And he said to me, the only people who had the guts to fight against Hitler were the communists. The Social Democrats betrayed us. He was a member of the radical underground. He was in London during World War II writing pro-Stalin releases for the Czech resistance. He told me and Condoleezza, we were in the room at the same time, that at Munich there was one power in Europe that was willing to stand for Czech democracy regardless of whether anybody else did. Just like they fought for the Spanish Republic, and that was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union betrayed more radical people. I was very critical of Stalin, naturally, he's a big murderer. But the fact is that I admired the Soviet effort in World War II and was thankful for it, and the world would have been better off if England and the United States had not been too cowardly to support the Spanish Republic, or too treacherous, or had not cooperated with and sold war goods to the Nazis. Corbell was a realist. He was a realist who wanted to advance human values, and he thought fascism and racism were not human values. When I said that he would turn over in his grave at what Condi had become, and that it is a treachery to Joe Corbell to bring him up as like Brent Scowcroft. Brent Scowcroft decently criticized the crazed neocon policy, right? But Brent Scowcroft, no Joe Corbell. That is not in this film, and it should be said. So I wanted to say it before we started out. Questions?
I'm coming not knowing very much about realism, but it does seem to me that great evil could be done through realism just as through idealism, or even a combination of the two. So maybe if you could sort for me a little bit, at least your perspective of where you walk, a good line between those.
It's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
All foreign policies are informed by fundamental values of the cultures in which nation states or ruling elites arise and from which they make foreign policy. But there's all sorts of contradictions, especially in the application. So regardless of what the motives are, let's say that your motive, at least in public, the rationale, is we're going to prevent a communist dictatorship from arising in Chile. Well, then in application, you can have a so-called realist like Henry Kissinger who says we can't allow a country, Chile, to go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people for having voted for a socialist government. What's the outcome? Mass murder backed by the United States when it overthrew the Allende government in 1973. I was there. It was pretty nasty. and implemented a dictatorship under Pinochet. Okay? So regardless of the motivation may be perfectly wonderful, at least in the abstract. But the implications for people can be very different. Okay? And it's not just a matter of unintended consequences. In large part, it's how the public is sold on the idea, for example, to go to war. In the case of Iraq, it's pretty clear from this film and from the other evidence that it alludes to that they committed crimes of torture in part to try to create the fabricated evidence they couldn't find to justify after the fact a war, an aggressive war, that was sold on false pretenses. Where after WMD, we're going to save you from WMD that Hussein is developing. That was clearly a lie. But it was a lie that was committed, supposedly with wonderful intentions, and in fact, the lie itself led to the greater crime, or a subsidiary crime, if you will, of torturing people to try to get them to say, yeah, there were WMD there. And on it goes. So I would simply say ignore the labels of realism, so-called, and idealism the way they're used here in an oversimplified way, and instead try to strip away the rationale of the policy and look at its actual effects. And then compare that to how it's sold, because this stuff is being done in our name. And if we are in fact a democracy, which I think is challengeable as a premise, then we have a responsibility to see to it that the people that we put in office, when they are caught lying and committing terrible crimes, aggressive war, a war crime, right? The greatest crime against humanity, and torture in order to justify an aggressive war, that they need to be brought to account. Because otherwise, people around the world are right to conclude, well, they're doing this in your name, and therefore, if you don't do something about it, you must approve. So, to me, that is the underlying moral and ethical question that is thrown back to us, living in an ostensibly democratic society, that this is crime that's done ostensibly for our benefit, and definitely done in our name.
If I could add just...
Well said.
Yeah.
Kissinger, when he said this horrible anti-democratic thing, is in fact not being a realist, or at least the way he's being a realist is kind of crude. There are many realists, and the leader of them was Hans Morgenthau, who were very confused about a lot of these issues. And I trace this in a book called Must Global Politics Constrain Democracy. But about Vietnam, Morgenthau was the leading professor in the United States to say this was a criminal enterprise. He was so frightened by it, or so shocked by it, that he actually talked about how there was a ruling class in the United States separated from reality and decency, and the only good thing that could happen in the United States would be a revolution against it. He didn't think that was possible, but he spoke out in the name of truth against power. And if you think about the theme of the movie and the corruption of realism, so-called realists are people who bend the facts and their views to gain power. Right now, the leading realist in the United States is a guy named John Mearsheimer. I'm in a lot of correspondence with him, including on my blog. Mearsheimer's written a couple of articles that Afghanistan is a complete disaster since the U.S. and white people occupied it, and in fact, they shouldn't escalate, they should get out yesterday. Mearsheimer wrote that. He's a guy at the University of Chicago. I think the same thing. He was a right-winger. About this issue, he is not a right-winger. And actually, it is his realism that makes him, about this issue, not a right-winger. He's as sharp as I am about the issue of drones blowing up innocent people and the hostility that it raises to the United States. He is also a very conservative guy who voted for Bush the first time around and has had to drink a lot of, I don't know, he's had to express some sorrow.
An antidote to Kool-Aid.